Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be learning with you as part of the Springsman at Drisha. Um, this is Rabbi Silber's shir on the Book of Exodus, Reclaiming the Past and Building the Future. Um, as per usual, I am going to be inviting everyone to join as panelist. That way we can see your friendly faces if you choose to show them, and you'll be able to unmute and ask questions when we pause for those. And in between those moments, you can uh, put your questions in the chat, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. Um, what else? And um, also in between those moments, just keep muted until you're ready to speak. You will also be able to send questions into the chat on Facebook on the live video. So, Moshe has been chosen to lead the Israelite slaves out of Egypt and bring them to their ancestral home through a careful reading of the first part of Exodus. We will explore the strategies employed by Moshe, the challenges and triumphs of our guiding hero. I will be sharing the sources on my screen. I'll also send you the link in Safaria. And with that, I'll give it to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me, right? Not a problem. Okay, great. Okay, let's begin. So we're going to essentially start towards the very beginning of Sefer Shemot. Pick up where we actually left off, and we'll start with the second chapter. So let me just say a couple of words about the book of Exodus, about Sefer Shemot. The book of Exodus is a distinct book. It stands by itself. It's one of the 5 Chumashim. Has its own structure. So, for example, just to demonstrate that it has its own integrity, the beginning, the first chapter of the book of Exodus talks about the new Paro who emerges, and enslaves the Jewish people, Bnei Israel. And what he has them do is he gives them a task to build store cities, Arei Miskanot LeParo, at Pitom Viet Ramses. And his objective there is not so much to gain, to benefit in any financial way. The Torah makes it clear is that his goal is to break the people down. As it says in the first chapter. That's how the book actually begins, with the enslaving of the people, the family of Yaakov, the people, because the family has become a nation. There's a lot of growth. And one of the mechanisms he used is to have them work for Pharaoh, to be slaves, and in point of fact, to build store cities. Arei Miskanot LeParo. It says nothing in the Torah about building the pyramids, but it does talk about building store cities. That's how the book begins. Now, the way the book ends, this book of 40 chapters ends, it ends with a lengthy description of 5 chapters, a little more than 5 chapters, of the building of the sanctuary, the building of the Mishkan. In fact, the Mishkan occupies a very prominent place in the book of Shemot. There are 5 chapters of the instructions how to build it, and there are 5 chapters describing that they did build it. So the book ends, as we have it, with constructing this building, this structure called the Mishkan, in which God will dwell. So it's a book that begins with building and a book that ends with building. So you see that it has a very nice structure to it. It has an envelope structure of building. Of course, one of the questions one can ask, we're not going to ask it right now, but it will come up hopefully, and that is, what is the difference between working for Paro on one hand and working for God on the other? There are several very important differences between work for Paro and working to build the Mishkan. That will come up in the course of time. But my point is a simple one at the outset. The book of Exodus is a discrete book. In fact, when you it's made clear, if you open up a Torah scroll, you open a Sefer Torah, and you will see that between the ending of Sefer Breshit and the book of Shemot, there are 4 blank lines. On the 5th line, you have V'yehu Shemot B'nai Yisrael. And that's true of the Chumashim. They're separated by 4 blank lines. And that's a demonstration that the tradition sees the story of the Exodus, the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, as we call it, book of names, as a distinct book. That's clear. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that the book of Exodus is simply a continuation of the book of Genesis, of Bereshit. It continues. In fact, the very first word in this book, V'yehu Shemot B'nai Yisrael, actually begins with the Vav, which is often a connective, and these are the names. So it's simply a continuation. Even more than that, and maybe we'll pick up with this theme over the course of time, which is an interesting one. Not only is Sefer Shemot a continuation of the previous book, but in fact, the very first chapter, for those who were with us the previous semester, the very first chapter picks up almost word for word with chapter 46 of Bereshit. The Torah gives us the names of Jacob's family as they are about to depart to Egypt, and the Torah repeats in short form, but repeats actually those verses in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus. So that means that the book of Exodus, number one, is picking up on what we had in the previous book. But number two, even more interesting than that, maybe we'll have time to go back and to explore this idea, but actually, it's not just that it continues the previous book. It doesn't actually continue from the end of the previous book. It actually continues the story from chapter 46. And what's interesting, if we think about it, is the reader, I think, is supposed to ask the question, let's say we just read consecutively. We read Genesis chapter 1, Bereshit 2, 3, 4, get to 46, and then we skip. From 46, we continue reading chapter 1 of the book of Shemot, because V'yehu Shemot, it's exactly parallel to chapter 46. How would we understand the book? Were we to read it directly? What are the implications of reading chapter 1 of Sefer Shemot as a continuation of chapter 46 of Sefer Bereshit? I'll leave that question for now, but I did want to make one other point before we start chapter 2. And that is, just one second, hold on. Yes, so one other point I want to make about the relationship of Sefer Shemot to the book that precedes it. My larger point being that when you're studying the book of Exodus, you have to study it as a discrete work in its own right. It may have references to what came before, but it's a discrete work. On the other hand, you can read it as simply a continuation. Don't think of it as two books. Think of it as one book. And what leads us in that direction is the following: that when you get to the end of this book, we're just at the beginning now, but when you get to the end of it and you read about the construction of the Mishkan, what becomes, I think, fairly clear to every reader, and was very clear to the Midrash and the commentaries, is that in the description of this sanctuary, this Mishkan, which concludes the book of Exodus, that the language draws very heavily from the first two creation narratives of the Torah. As if to say that, and I believe this is a very important point that we will touch on, have some new ideas about it too, but as if to say the Torah begins with two creations. There's the world, and there's the Garden of Eden. And in fact, the world is destroyed and recreated, but the Garden of Eden is the place you never go back to. You can never return to Eden. But what the Torah sets up in the book of Bereshit is a kind of alternative Eden. You don't go back to Eden, but there can be alternatives to Eden. Let's call it sacred spaces. One might be the land of Canaan, but the other one is certainly some kind of sacred space within the land of Canaan. In the book of Bereshit, it's Har Moriah, it's the place of the Akedah. Maybe it's the place where Jacob goes to sleep, Beit El. Those are alternative sacred spaces. But the alternative sacred space, when you read through the book of Exodus, is clearly the space which the human being and God somehow can dwell together apart from the fact that Israel in the desert is living around the center of the camp, which is the Mishkan, but the Mishkan is sacred space. So you can read the Mishkan. The reason that the description of the Mishkan in this book draws so heavily from the creation narratives of Breshit is simply because, presumably, the Mishkan is in fact the ultimate alternative to Eden. It is like Eden, similar in so many ways. It's not Eden. You can't go back there for any number of reasons, but it's kind of alternative to Eden. And therefore, the language describing the Mishkan at the end of the book is all language from creation narratives. So if you think of it in those terms, then you're thinking of the book of Exodus and the book of Breshit and Shemot, basically one book. There's the story of part one. The last word of the previous book was the word Mitzrayim. That's how the book of Breshit ended. The last word is Egypt. And the last words of this book that we're studying now, which the Ramban called the Book of Redemption, Sefer HaGeula, the Book of Redemption, and the culminating verses of this book are the alternative Eden, alternative to Eden, the sacred space where God can dwell amongst the people. So once again, we have to hold these two thoughts simultaneously. We always think of Exodus as a separate book in and of itself. It is certainly that. But we're also reminding ourselves always that in a certain sense, it's simply a continuation of what came before. And over time, we'll see from time to time, be able to reflect on what that might be saying to us as we study the book. Okay, that is by way of a very brief introduction. And now let us begin with chapter 2. Chapter 2 is the story begins with the birth of Moshe and tells the story about Moshe is the hero, the central figure of chapter 2. It begins with his birth. So let's begin. I'll pause periodically and take comments and questions. If someone has a question, you can speak up. Okay, so let's begin with chapter 2. Chapter 2 begins, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi. Strange verse. A man went from the house of Levi and took a woman who was a daughter of Levi, bat Levi, a woman from the house of Levi, a daughter, literally a daughter of Levi. And the first thing we notice is, apart from the fact that it seems to be significant that the couple are both from the tribe of Levi. That seems to be significant, right? Torah singles that out, that they're from the tribe of Levi. But what's also even more interesting and connected is the Torah does tell us that a man went from the house of Levi and he marries a Levite woman. And of course, these are going to be the parents of Moshe. And one would have expected, presumably, that in this very first verse, the Torah would have given us the names of Moshe's parents. It's Moshe Rabbeinu. Who are his parents? You read verse number 1, a Levite man took a Levite woman. Why doesn't the Torah tell us their names? What makes that question even more interesting is that whereas in this verse, there is no name mentioned, and we did expect to see a name, but lo and behold, when you jump ahead a few chapters and you come to chapter 6, then suddenly we have a genealogy of the Jewish people, but a very, very strange genealogy, because the genealogy, which begins in chapter 6, I'm not going to read the whole genealogy, but it's found in chapter 6, beginning with verse number 14, Elo Roshei Beit Avotam, and you have a genealogy there, and it's very interesting. We have no other genealogy like it in the Bible, because it starts with these are the sons of Reuven. It talks about Reuven's children, Reuven's family. Reuven being the oldest son of Yaakov, Leah's child, and then it moves next to Shimon. These are the family of Shimon and his genealogy. Shimon is the second oldest son, and then you come to Levi. Levi is the third oldest son. This is all in chapter 6, beginning in verse number 14, all the way to pretty much to the end of the chapter. And then, lo and behold, you expect the Torah to continue with son number 4, who was Yehuda. But no, when you get to Levi, then the Torah stops. There's no more genealogy. We've never seen anything like this, nor do we see anything like it in the rest of the Bible either, where you have a partial genealogy, and it takes you only up through the tribe of Levi, and it concludes with statements about Moshe and Aaron. So clearly, the significance of the direction of it, the Torah wants to tell us about Moshe and Aaron, who their family is, etc. And it actually tells us, I'll just read you in chapter 6, let me just find this. Vayikach, let's see, where we have this over here. Chapter 6, verse number 20. Vayikach Amram et Yocheved Dodato lo leisha, v'ateler lo et Aaron v'et Moshe, u'shnei chayei Amram sheva u'shloshim u'ma'at shana. Okay, this is chapter 6, and the Torah says that Amram took his aunt. Amram marries his aunt. That itself is very striking. Why is that very striking that Amram marries his aunt? Somebody want to suggest why that is striking for us?
I think you're not allowed to in the Torah.
You're not allowed to. That's exactly right. It's on the list of forbidden relationships. So it's very striking. So, okay, it's before the Torah is given and all that. He marries his aunt. But my point is a simple one, which is...
She's Bat Levi.
She what?
She's actually Bat Levi. Sorry.
She's actually...
Bat Levi. She's actually...
Bat Levi. She is. And he's a man from Levi.
No, but she really is Bat Levi.
Right. Well, he is actually a Ben Levi, right? That's true, right? That's true. The fact, right? She's Bat Levi. That's very correct. And the fact is, my point is, the Torah has actually told us not just the name of his father, but actually, and this is not typical in the Torah told us the name of Moshe's mother in chapter 6. And not only that, one might say that in chapter 6, if we assume that the goal of the Torah largely is to tell us who Moshe and Aaron are, of course, it also tells us about Aaron. It tells about Aaron, of course, Amram is Aaron's father, and then it says that whom Aaron married. So it tells us even the wives, which it typically does not do. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we account for the fact that in the genealogy of chapter 6, in a sense, there's too much information? Too much information. We don't typically get this kind of information. And then in chapter 2, we have no information. Well, what do we make of this, I would say, radical imbalance between the second chapter, which gives us not even the name of people that it's going to name later, who the Ben Levi and the Bat Levi are, and yet in chapter 2 there's no names whatsoever. So that is some actually very interesting point. I would say even beyond that, what's even more striking about chapter 6, it sounds like the Torah starts from Ruvain, then you get to Shimon, then you get to Levi. It's as if the Torah is saying, let me give you a genealogy, but when you get to Moshe and Aaron, there's no point to go further. The whole goal was to get to Moshe and Aaron, as the Torah emphasizes in chapter 6, to the extent that we're even going to give you the names of Ruvain and Shimon, because they're older than Levi, then you get to Levi, and then the Torah stops. And there's actually something else curious about chapter 6, which I'm not going to get into now, which is that not only does the Torah give us this genealogy, but the Torah does something else which is very strange, which is when it comes to Levi, and it comes to Kahat, his son, and it comes to Amram, his son, and it comes to Moshe and Aaron, they actually tell us how many years they lived. In the case of Moshe and Aaron, it says how many years they are when they take upon their mission to free the people from the land of Egypt. So the genealogies are very interesting. But coming back to our verse, it puts in relief the obvious point. Why has the Torah not, in fact, given us the names over here, given the fact that it's going to name them later? And I think what we have to say is that for whatever reason, the Torah has here concealed the names. Because when you think about this chapter, it's not just Moshe's father and Moshe's mother who have no name, but as we continue to read the story in the birth of Moshe, what's very striking is that this child that's born also has no name. At least he has no name initially. Let's just read a little bit more, and we'll reflect upon this. So, in the second verse, it says that Vatar ha'isha v'ateled ben. So the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. Vatera oto ki tovu. Vatitzbeneu shlosha yirachim. She saw that he was tov, that he was good, and she hid him for 3 months. The rabbinic understanding of that is he was born prematurely. You have to remember that in chapter 1, Pharaoh commanded his people that all male children should be thrown into the Nile. So the commentaries say maybe they were checking. If someone was pregnant, they would try to find out when she's due. But this child was born prematurely, so she was able to hide him for a certain amount of time. Even if you don't want to take that as the literal meaning, but it does say she tries to hide him. She hides him initially, but after a point in time she can't hide him anymore. So they devised a different plan somehow to save this child. But notice what's not found in the verse is the child was born, and you might have thought, and they would give the child a name, but no name is mentioned in the second verse. She can't hide him anymore in verse number 3. V'yochol haspino, v'tikacho tevat gomer, v'tachmiro b'chemor v'zafet, v'tosem b'tayeled, v'tosem b'suf al svat hayar. She can't hide him anymore. She's some kind of a basket, and she puts it with pitch, and she puts a child into it. This basket is called the teva. We're familiar with the word teva from the book of Breshit. A teva is an ark. Tevat Noach. Noach is commanded to go into a teva, into an ark, and somehow to take some of the animals with him and to allow the world to continue to be. So she puts him in a teva, and then vatetatzav achoto merachok, and his sister is watching from a distance, l'de'ah ma yeyaselo, to learn what would befall him. So here we have a striking situation. You have a child is born, but is not given a name. Usually you name the child upon birth or a few days later, but you name the child. The mother's not named, the father's not named, even though later was given the name. And then in the fourth pasuk, the sister is standing from afar, to know what would befall the child. Well, we know at least one sister of Moshe certainly has a name, and she's quite prominent. It's one of the more prominent women of the Torah, which is Miriam. I presume that it's Miriam, but if it is Miriam, what do you mean her sister? But the woman's got a name. So it would appear that the Torah actually is purposely concealing the names. And that is very striking for the simple reason, and I think we discussed this in the past, that this book that we're starting to study now is the first words of the book are V'yelah Shemot. The book begins with names. That's how the book begins. The book of names gives us all the names. They all came down with names. They came down with a bayit, and they came down with names. And now suddenly in chapter 2, the Torah seems to be telling us they have no names. There's a concealing of the names. And of course, the question that we discussed this a bit in the past, why is that? How does it come to pass that people who came down to Egypt with names suddenly are nameless? And we discussed several possibilities. One could be, from a positive standpoint, that the people have multiplied like crazy. There's Paru, Vayishritzu, Vayirbu, Vayatzbu, that somehow it came down as a family, but we're coming, but at least in terms of the numbers, we're becoming a nation. We have so many people, and when you have so many people, there's often a loss of identity of the individual person. When you're a small number of people, you know them all by name. But when you have a big group, and suddenly in your factory, not 5 people working, but 1,000 people, you already know the people by name. So there's a loss of that. With that kind of a growth comes a loss of identity. That's one possibility. But the other two possibilities, which are less happy, are either that the loss of name here, identity, they came down to Egypt, we came down with names, with an identity, with Jacob's family. But over the course of time, this is one possibility, we begin to assimilate into Mitzrayim. We lose a sense of our identity, who we actually are. That's certainly a possibility. And we're talking about assimilating into Mitzrayim. That's one possibility. And a different possibility, which seems to be exactly the opposite idea, but I'm not sure the two can't coexist, is that a loss of identity, a loss of a name, is a function of the persecution. Because what's happened is we came down as free people. But over the course of time, with the new Pharaoh, who enslaves us, and when you're a slave, to some degree, there's a loss of your identity. Or so it could be a loss of your identity, because you can't really be who you are. You can't develop the way you want to develop. To be a slave means to be controlled by somebody else. You do what the other person wants you to do, and in such a circumstance, you don't have a name. You don't have an identity. The name is your identity. So these are three possibilities as to why, perhaps, we discover in the beginning of chapter 2 that there are no names. Not the father, not the mother, not the sister, and not the baby, actually, who is not named upon birth. So that's an important point, and it speaks very well. And if this be the case, then the book of Exodus, which is the book of redemption, that what has to happen in the book of Exodus, the task of the one that will take us out, who will be Moshe, is to install in the people, to give the people a sense of actually who they are, to give them, one might say, a name. And that's going to be one of Moshe's tasks, to try to tell the people about who they are, that is to say, where they're coming from, and what their possibilities are, and what their destiny is. That will be Moshe's role. But we notice right away there's a loss of name. Okay, let me just stop here for a second. If anybody has any comments or questions, I'll take that now. You don't have to. I'll continue, but you can always speak up. That was verse number 1. Let me go back to the second pasuk over here. Second pasuk said, "Vatera oto ki tovu." The child is born. Vatera oto ki tovu, vatitzbeneu shlosha yirachim. She saw. Now the translator here, whatever translation this is, it might be JPS. Yes, JPS translation. They're translating tov as beautiful. Vatera oto ki tovu. She saw the child was beautiful. She hid the child for 3 months. The commentaries here, starting with the Ramban, but basically all asking the same question, namely, what do you mean? What do you mean the child is beautiful, it was good, and she hid him? And if the child was not beautiful, she wouldn't try to hide him. She's trying to keep him alive. Pharaoh has them throwing the boys into the Nile. So what do you mean Vatera oto ki tovu? The Ramban has his particular answer. The Ramban answers that the word tov here doesn't mean good. But the word tov for the Ramban in these contexts means viable. The child is born prematurely. Sometimes premature babies have issues. Can they make it, not make it, whatever, as we know. But she saw that this child actually has the ability to survive. That's the Ramban, Vatera oto ki tovu. And the Ramban, to buttress his case, I'm not sure it buttresses his case, but the Ramban says, he cites the psukim in the beginning of the Torah. Because in the beginning of the Torah, the first created thing, God is the light. Vayomer Elohim yihiyar vayihiyar. God said, let there be light, and there was light. Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, vayavdel Elohim bein ha'or uvein ha'choshev. God saw that the light was good. Ramban asks, and God doesn't know before God created it that it's going to be good? What does it mean God saw it was good? And if it wasn't good, he will what? So the Ramban says, no, it doesn't mean that. Of course God knows it's going to be good. But the point is, Vayar ki tov, the Ramban interprets all the ki tovs in the first chapter is that God determined that it should continue to be. The Ramban, it's very Greek in a certain way. It's Aristotle. In other words, the Ramban asked the question, which we don't ask. if something is created, okay, you create something. God creates something. Okay, so it's now created. Why does it continue to be? And the Ramban's answer to that, this is an interesting answer, is that it continues to be because God's sustaining will keeps it alive, as it were. We see things very differently. We say an object in motion remains in motion. Something's moving, it continues, it'll move forever. It doesn't need any new thing to keep it moving. It moves. For the Ramban, for Aristotle, no, you have to explain why it keeps going. So for the Ramban, we have this in our prayers in a certain way. Hamechadesh b'choyom tuvo b'tuvo maseh b'reshit. It's exactly the Ramban, who renews every day b'tuvo, with God's goodness. God, every morning you wake up, the world is now reborn. The world is recreated, as it were. So the Ramban interprets this way: the child is born prematurely, and the mother sees, but this child can make it. The child could in fact survive. It's not that the child is not a viable child. That's the Ramban's interpretation. But the truth of the matter is that Rashi actually, tovu, so Rashi says, Nitmalei habayit ora. The house was filled with light. And what Rashi is doing is connecting these words of kitov to the beginning of the Torah. I started this morning, here it's the afternoon, by talking about the connections of Breshit and Shemot. And the first created thing was the light. So what you have over here, Rashi doesn't say this with his words, but this is what the Medrash is getting at, I think, that what you have over here is a kind of creation story. That the book of Exodus is about creation. The book of Genesis has creation, but the book of Exodus also has creation, because in the very beginning of the book, the language to describe the Jewish people's growth, paru, vayishmetzu, vayerbu, vayatzvu, is all language taken from chapter 1 of the Torah. And Tov is Kitov. The first created thing was the light. Vayahu himetar Kitov. So Rashi commented, when Moshe was born, the house was filled with light. And actually the support for Rashi, the support for this midrashic reading, and all that it implies, can be found in the very next verse, which is verse number 3. She saw she could not hide him anymore. What does she do? Vatikacho tevat gomer, vatach meraba chemoru vazovet, vatosem ba tayewed, vatosem basuf al svat hayar. She puts him in a teva. She puts him in an ark. Now, of course, we're familiar with the ark from the book of Breshit, because what the ark is about in Sefer Breshit is the world has been deluged, there's the flood, everything is destroyed, and the ark is God's way of keeping that first world, in a sense, alive. It's a new world, but it's also connected to the old world. And what makes that possible is that Noach is told to build a teva, to build an ark. So over here, in verse number 2, we have Vatero Tokitovu, which recalls the first creation. And then in verse number 3, we have Moshe, who is destined to be thrown into the raging waters, into the Nile, just as the world was destroyed by the flood. But somehow his mother and his sister somehow conspire some way. They have a plan to keep this child alive, just as Noach actually is the remnant of that first world who builds a new world. So too over here, this child, about whom we know nothing at this point, will be the one might say, to build a new world. That in the book of Shemot, it is a creation story. It's the creation of this people, which is parallel to the creation of the world in the first book of the Torah. And just like the first book of the Torah, there's the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of its alternatives, which are the land of Canaan, the place of the Akedah, Hashem Yireh, Har Hashem Yireh. In the book of Exodus, there will also be a special sacred place, which will be the end of the book, which will be the Mishkan. We're talking here about a creation, so we've already encountered now 3 different places in the first, just a little more than 1 chapter, where the Torah has referenced creation. Paru vayishmetzu vayirbu vayatzmu in chapter 1, Kitov in chapter 2, the Teva in chapter 2. So we have here what might I say, a new creation narrative. Fine. Now we have the following. The sister stands from a distance, to know what will be done, what would befall this child. So this is actually an interesting pasuk. The sister is watching from a distance. It becomes clear from the story, its continuation. She's watching from a distance to know what would happen to this child. She's not watching from a distance because she's afraid to get too close or anything like that. She's not keeping her distance because she's not concerned. It's exactly the opposite. She's keeping a distance with dayah. And here it's interesting, the Torah didn't say lirot ma'asalo, to see, but rather with dayah. The word dayah is a word that is prominent in the book of Exodus. It appears in many, many of the stories. It's a central word in the book of Exodus. I would argue it's even more central in the book of Genesis. That, and maybe we'll come to this, how dot is a central word, not just in Exodus, but it's a central word in the book of Breshit, in the Torah. A central, maybe the central word. So it suggests to know, suggests concern. Sometimes the word dot is used sexually. It means connecting. To know means to be involved in, to connect to care for. Remember in chapter 1 when the new Pharaoh emerges. He didn't know Joseph. What does it mean he didn't know Joseph? First of all, how is that even possible? Joseph was the viceroy of Egypt who saved Egypt and who saved Pharaoh, who empowered Paro. So it's very hard to believe that any Pharaoh would not know of Joseph. Not knowing of Joseph means he doesn't want to know. It means he doesn't care. And this is the theme that will appear and reappear. And here the sister stands from a distance, merachok, to know what would befall this child. And here we come to an interesting intertext. This particular little short verse, verse number 4, does recall for us another story in the Torah that we have encountered back in the book of Breshit. What story is that? What story
Hagar.
is that?
Hagar.
Yes, it is. That's the story of Hagar. But there, remember, there's a story where they sent out into the desert and Hagar was given water and provisions, but she gets lost. She gets lost and she runs out of water. They're in a desert with no water. Looks very bad. And she takes her child and she puts him under some brushes. Harchek kimetacha vekeshes. Far away, harchek, a bow shot away. For she said, I can't look it. I can't see my child die. So she puts him far away, harchek kimetacha vekeshet. And the Torah actually, whatever we may think of that, the Torah does criticize her for that. Because she starts to cry, and then God says to Hagar, God heard the cry of the boy, even though it never says he's crying. And God says to Hagar, what are you crying about? God has heard the crying of the boy, the child who was crying, the nar bocheh. We'll come to that phrase very soon, the nar bocheh, right? Ba'asher hu sham, the one who's over there. The one who is over there is a critique. The one that you placed far away from you and you kept your distance. So over here, we have a parallel verse, but over here it's different. Here she stands from a distance with to know what shall be. Now it's very hard to know whether they have a preconceived plan over here. In the very next verse, we have Pharaoh's daughter coming on the scene. And it's hard to know if the sister and the mother have conspired somehow. Maybe they know the way Pharaoh's daughter behaves. It's very hard to tell, but certainly she's looking out to see. Maybe someone will see this child floating at the edge of the river and have pity on the child, which is what happens. But I just started to jump ahead to one verse number 6, when it says Pharaoh's daughter sees the ark, sees the mini ark, and she sends her servant to fetch it. And then in verse number 6, Vatiftach vatireu et hayeled, she sees the child, V'nei na'ar bocheh, and behold, the child, it's called the nar over here, na'ar bocheh. Rashi's bothered by the word nar, because Rashi thinks a nar is old. This is basically a newborn. The Ramban says sometimes a newborn is called a nar. But I wonder whether the choice of nar bocheh, which is strange, but the word hinei nar bocheh is exactly the language that the book of Breshit uses when it talks about Yishmael. Why are you crying? God has heard, right? God has heard the cry of the nar. So the Torah uses exactly the same language over here when it refers to Moshe. Hinei nar bocheh, and she has pity on him, and she says, this must be a Hebrew child. So here we have an interesting parallel to Hagar, that Miriam stands in relationship to this child the way Hagar stood in relationship to Ishmael. The difference is that in the case of Hagar, she keeps her distance. I don't want to see the child die. In the case over here, she's looking very carefully to know what shall happen. And when she sees Pharaoh's daughter, she's going to race down, and she's going to somehow get Pharaoh's daughter to allow this child to be brought back to his natural mother. I did want to, before I stop to take any comments or questions, did want to make one point about the story of the sister standing from a distance. The sister standing from a distance, and the connection to, in fact, to Hagar. And what I want to put out there, and I think this is an important point for our story, is that the chapter begins by saying, a man went from the house of Levi, he took a daughter of Levi. So this child has a mother and a father. But when you read the story, actually, as it unfolds, you have the mother, it says, hides him. Vatitzpeneo, she hides him. She puts him in an ark. And then you have the sister is watching from a distance. If it's parallel to Hagar, then Hagar, in fact, is Ishmael's mother. So the sister over here, who is watching out, is essentially a kind of Hagar figure, a mother figure, who's also watching out for the child. And then, in the intermediate verse, between finding this crying child, in verse number 5 in the next pasuk, it says, Vateret bat paro lechotz al hayar, v'narotel hochot al yad hayar, vateret hateva b'toch hasuf, vatishlach et amata vatikochea. So Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe, and she notices the basket among the reeds, and she sends her slave girl to fetch it. And in the story now, you're going to have the conversation between the sister and Pharaoh's daughter. And they're going to come to an agreement. We'll get to it in a couple of minutes. They're going to come to an agreement because the sister says, maybe I can find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. And she says, you find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child, I'll pay for it. And the child is brought back to his natural mother. So in the story, basically, in terms of who was the parent of this child, who still has no name, by the way. She doesn't name him when she takes him out of the water either. The nameless child. So who are the parents in the story? I would say there's Pharaoh's daughter who will adopt him. He will be brought back to Pharaoh's daughter. There's the natural mother who will nurse him. There's the sister who plays a kind of role of mother, watching out to try to arrange. Maybe the mother and the sister have this prearranged plan or plot that somehow they're going to work together to save this child. So you're talking about 3 mother figures in the story, and who was conspicuously absent is the father. Father's not mentioned at all. You would know there is a father, actually. I mean, he begets the child, but outside of that, he's not in the story. So that's going to be actually a very important point about Moshe. That 2 points. First of all, I would call him a man without a father. And one of the themes of these chapters will be Moshe will find his father. Moshe will have a father in this story, in the larger story, but it's not the father that you expect him to have. It's not clearly has any connection to Amram whatsoever. Never speaks to Amram. He has maybe a couple of father figures, but the primary father figure of Moshe, and this is a very important point, it's when God speaks to Moshe in chapter 3, the next chapter, the burning bush, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moshe has a father. He maybe have three fathers. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Those are Moshe's parents. We'll talk about that. That's a very important point. But the Torah has already set it up in the second chapter. That's number one. The second point is that in the story over here, and I'm just presuming everybody knows what happens here. We'll read it in a minute. But this is leaving the sister out for a moment. He has the woman who adopts him. He's a child. He's Pharaoh's daughter's child, basically. She's going to adopt him. She has pity on him. She's going to adopt him. On the other hand, this child will be brought back to his mother, who is going to nurse him. And the nursing over here clearly is not just about biological or physical, but the idea of the nursing in the story is to give Moshe some kind of Jewish identity. So he's a person, actually. If you say, who is this kid? Is he a Jew? Is he an Egyptian? I would say, at the outset, I don't know, because he has a Hebrew mother, who, on the other hand, he's brought up by Pharaoh's daughter. She may be a wonderful human being. She sounds like a wonderful human being, but she's not a Jew. She is Pharaoh's daughter. So in terms of the identity of the child, what the Chumash is setting up is the question, at the end of the day, Moshe will choose to be a Jew, actually, and what factors into his decision to be Jewish. I'll stop in 1 minute. Before I stop, though, I didn't want to make one other point, that the story of the birth of Moshe and the character of Moshe is, and this is the way the Bible works. There are characters and other characters built upon the first character. Now, there is no other Moshe. He's unique. But that's not to say that there aren't other characters who the writer of particular books uses Moshe as a model for them. In a positive way, they fall short, but they basically built on Moshe. And one of the characters that's built upon Moshe, maybe there are two that are obviously built on Moshe, but one is, of course, Shmuel. The character of Shmuel is drawn from Moshe in many, many ways, both similarities and also distinctions. The distinctions are a function of the similarities. But what's interesting about Shmuel is, among many, many other things, is that if you remember the story of Shmuel, the birth of Shmuel, so his mother Hannah prays for a child, and she has a child, and her husband is named Elkanah. We read this Haftorah on Rosh Hashanah, and Hannah took a vow. She took a neder. If you give me a child, says Hannah, I will dedicate the child to God all of his days. So meanwhile, the husband, Elkanah, goes periodically up to the temple, which is in Shiloh. He goes miyamim yamima. He's one of these guys who looks at the calendar. That's when you go. So after the child is born, he's ready to take another pilgrimage. He says to Hannah, we're taking a pilgrimage. Come along, dear. She says, I prefer not to go. He says, you're not going to go? He's very concerned about that. She says, I'm going to go, but not now. I will. I want to nurse the child first. And he's okay. Make sure you do it. And that's exactly what happens. Then she nurses the child. Then she leaves the child there. Doesn't take the child back. Child grows up in Shiloh. He ministers under Eli, the high priest, who was his teacher. But there you have the similar idea that the nursing is not just a physical thing. What she's really saying is, leave his education to me. I can't leave it to anybody else. I can't leave it to Shiloh. I got to take care of it myself. So this is the story of Moshe, that actually the idea is to somehow get this child back to his natural mother. The nursing is the inculcating of values. But Moshe, on the other hand, is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Okay. Let me stop you at this for a moment and take comments or questions, and then we'll continue.
Rabbi Silber, you said that
Yes.
Moshe's father is Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, but doesn't he have a relationship to Israel in a similar way?
Yes.
And what do you make of that in terms of understanding who Moshe is?
Well, I make a lot of it, actually. I think you're right. I think that Yisro is a kind of father figure to him. And we'll talk about Yisro. Yisro is Reuel. Yisro is, I agree with you. I think that Reuel is a kind of father figure to Moshe. He's a deeply religious person. They have very similar values. What Yitro cares about and Moshe care about, at least initially, are very, very similar. They care about justice, basically. They care about equity and justice. So I think that's a good point. I think what the interesting part of the story, without jumping too far ahead here, is that Moshe is summoned by God to go back to Egypt and to save the Jewish people. And we'll study that story, but bottom line of it is that what God says to Moshe is, you have to save your brothers. God refers to the Jewish people as the children of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So when Moshe has to do, Moshe is very unwilling to do it. And maybe one of the reasons is, he has a million excuses, but perhaps leaving Yitro is itself problematic. And Yitro is somebody he actually has a common cause with. Yitro and Moshe see the world very similarly. They love each other. It's Moshe's great friend is Yitro. And but he has to leave because he has a different mission. His mission is to save his brothers, sisters, whatever. And Yitro is not a brother. Yitro is a Midianite priest, so he has to leave. He has to leave all that behind. It's it's a part of Moshe's life. One can see Moshe's life as elements of tragedy from a personal standpoint, but this is his mission, which he accepts, he grudgingly accepts, I would say. But once you accept it, you have to go back to Egypt. And Moshe has no reason, as we will see, to be particularly fond of the Jewish people, given the fact that his exile is one way or another a function of the Jews, that they're the cause of his exile. So, and the cause of him being under threat of death, so he has to run away. But at the end of the day, he will agree to go. But your point is very well taken. Yitro is without question, in my view, I agree with you completely. He's a kind of father figure to Moshe. He's Moshe's spiritual, maybe he's an early first Rebbe, one might even say. But he has to leave him behind. Yitro appears both in end of chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and appears, of course, in the Torah reading in chapter 18, which is very interesting. But hopefully we'll get to some of these things. Anybody else with any comments or questions? Okay, so let's continue. Right. Let us continue. Fine. So we have the fine. So Pharaoh's daughter sees this child in the fifth pasuk, and the child, and she has pity on the child in verse number 6. And now suddenly the sisters in the mix. Vatomer achoto el bat paro. Hailech b'karati loach isha meineket min avriot v'teinik loach et hayeled. Should I call a nursing woman from the Hebrews? She says, who can nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter presumes this must be a Hebrew child, because the Hebrew childs were under the threat of death, and when they were told to throw them into the Nile. So she understands this is a Hebrew child. By the way, in adopting Moshe, Pharaoh's daughter is going against her father. Her father said very clearly, commanded everyone to throw the boys into the river, and their boys basically right in the river, just take them and throw them in the river. She refuses to do that because she has mercy. Here we have an important point about the story, and actually a very unique point about the story. The story of the that we are beginning to study now, there aren't too many stories like this, but this particular story, I could say very clearly, is a story about the women. In other words, what Pharaoh said in chapter 1 is, kill the boys, keep the girls alive. Okay, keep the girls alive means to enslave the girls, basically. It means take them into the harem or whatever. It's not so pleasant for the girls either, that's for sure. But on the other hand, kill the boys and take the girls suggests to Paro, I think, so he suggests to the reader that from Paro's perspective, the girls aren't a problem. In other words, the boys are dangerous, but the girls, just take them for ourselves. Don't bother throwing them into the river. And when you think about the story over here, it's all about the women. It's Moshe's mother, it's Pharaoh's own daughter, it's Moshe's sister. So there's something ironic over here about, the fact that Paro sees no danger in the women, but it's actually the women who are able to pick up the slack and to allow redemption to hopefully take place. So there's a kind of irony over here. There aren't too many stories like this. Yes, and also the midwives is very well said. Shifra and Pua, of course. So thank you for that addition. It's certainly the case. So it's the women who, in their own way, are essentially responsible. They make the redemption possible. Let's put it that way. Without them, there's no redemption. It's a kind of irony of his own daughter. His own daughter is unwilling to go along with the father's decree. It's not clear whether the midwives are Jews or Egyptians. It's a question. But either way, especially if they're not Jewish, it's about the women having a kind of reverence for life and being unwilling to simply throw children into the river. So the sister says to Paro's daughter, should I find some woman to nurse this child? And I will pay you. I'd be willing to pay for it. So Paro's daughter says, right? Paro's daughter says, she offers to pay. You find a woman, I will pay the wages. I will pay the wages is a way of saying, I think, among other things, that Paro's daughter is saying, listen, this is my child. So of course I'm going to pay for it because I'm sure Paro's daughter has plenty of access to money. But the point is, Aniyatenes Charech underscores the question about this child. Is the child a Jew? Is the child an Egyptian? The one who's going to adopt him makes it pretty clear that it's her child. Because, you can find some nursing woman, but I'm going to pay for it because it's my kid. So that's what happens. So the sister actually takes the child back to his mother, Batnikeil, and the mothers. Now Moshe has two mothers, one might say. Let's read a little more. Scroll down. Yeah, keep going. Okay. Now it says, Vayigdal hayeled, v'atviyeu lebat paro, v'yilal levein. This is clear. So the child grows up. The child has been fully nursed. She brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter. V'yilal levein. He was to her a son. This child is the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Vatikra shemo Moshe. And she named him Moshe. Vatomer, for she said, Ki min hamayim mishitiyu, I have drawn him out of the water. So here, two comments. First of all, notice that there were many opportunities to give this boy a name. When he's first born, when Pharaoh's daughter sees him, when maybe when the sister runs down, when the mother, the natural mother, actually gets the child back to nurse. Well, I would have expected it then that the mother would name her child. There's no mention of that. In fact, the name of Moshe is given by Pharaoh's daughter, and what's even more striking is because she says, I drew him from the water. But she drew him from the water a very long time ago. We don't know how long the nursing took place, but it could be 2 years. Could be maybe even more. And the fact is, he's named by her for what happened earlier. She could have said, she could have named him the Torah could have said, she drew him from the water, a child, and she likes the child. I'll call him Moshe. But no, the Torah, as it were, is delaying. The name is delayed over here. So yes, the act of naming is an act of parenthood. She is, and it says he became a child. But what the Torah has done is to delay the name that is given until after the child has been nursed. And I think the point is what the Torah is interested in over here is emphasizing that this is a boy who is an Egyptian boy. He's also from the Ivrim, and we don't know which way he's going to go. Mother seems to be a lovely human being. She's a Mitzri. So is he a Jew or is he a Hebrew? Or is he an Egyptian? What is this child? Now, the other point I want to make before we get to the next verse is the following. She named him Moshe, for she said, Ki min hamayim mishitiyu, for I drew him out of the water. But actually, there's a problem over here with the name, because I drew him out of the water. So that would be, this is the child that was drawn out of the water. In which case, we shouldn't call him Moshe. We should call him the one who was drawn out, which would be Moshui. His name should be Moshui, right? Moshui, the one who was drawn out. But she doesn't name him Moshui, the one who was drawn out. She names him Moshe. And what does the name Moshe mean? Moshe does not mean the one who is drawn out. Moshe means the one who draws out. And over here, you see straight up, the names of the great characters are often not names. Because what is the mission of this boy going to be? Well, he's going to take us out of Egypt, basically. He's going to be Moshe us. He's going to draw us out. And one might say, even beyond that, Moshe himself is placed in the water. In a certain sense, he has experienced what his fellow Jewish boys are experiencing. Namely, he is placed in the water. He could easily be killed there. He manages somehow to escape. And his role will be then, the same way he was drawn out of the water, his role will be to draw others out of the water, out of the waters of Mitzrayim, out of the suffering of Mitzrayim. One might say that a person who himself was drawn from the water has a responsibility to try to draw other people from the water. So the name Moshe is a very striking name. He's the one who will draw us out, Moshe, for he was drawn from the water. Okay. Let me take one more verse and I'll stop and take comments and questions.
Could it
Yes.
be I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's a reference also to Kriyas Yamsuf, to the one who leads out of the water.
That's probably true as well. That's true. Which is the last step, basically. That's true. It's a good point. That again, walking through the water, taking us out of Mitzrayim, and that's the point of. That's when we leave Mitzrayim completely. That's when we're not to see them again. But that's very well said. So this is what this is his name. His name is the one who would draw us out. Is Moshe.
And then the part that water plays in the whole history, first the water as a positive role with Moshe and the people, and then ultimately the break, it comes also with water.
That's right. And we will discuss that. Very true. And the first place they come to after they cross the sea is the place is Marah, the place of the bitter waters. So water plays a role throughout the story. It's a kind of very important marker in the story, as you have noticed, and we will hopefully proceed through the book. Okay, I'll take one more verse and stop and take questions. And here's the point. It says, Vayihi bayamim hahem, vayidam Moshe vayetzeh lechav. In those days, here they translate sometime after that. Vayigdal, Moshe grew up. Vayetzeh elechav, he went out to his brothers. Vayar b'sivlotam, he saw their suffering. Vayar ish mitzri, makeh ish ivri, meyachav. He saw an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, one of his literally brothers. Brother in the Chumash generally doesn't mean your actual brother necessarily, but someone that you are related to. It could be family, it could be a fellow Jew. That's a brother. Now, the question is actually, when you read the verse, Moshe grew up and went out to his brothers, you really don't know who the brothers are. I mean, because he's brought up by Pharaoh's daughter, right? It says, Vahi Leben, he's the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So, he's an Egyptian. I mean, when Moshe runs away and he meets the daughters of the priest and they come home and he helps them out, how come you're home so early, my girls? That's what the father says. Oh, Ish Mitzri Hitzilanu Miyad, an Egyptian guy helped us out. That's how they see him, as the Ish Mitzri. So when Moshe goes out, we're told that he's the child of Pharaoh's daughter. Vayetzeh elechav, he went out to the brothers. The reader doesn't really know what brothers we're talking about. Does he mean fellow Egyptians? Does he mean Jews? But when it says Vayar b'sivlotam, he saw their suffering, then we know it's got to be the Jews, and the Torah makes it clear he sees the Egyptian beating the Jew. Another question we can ask ourselves is why? Why? By why I mean what turns Moshe into a Jew, given the fact that the Torah is making it clear as the bell that he's got two mothers. He could be the Egyptian, and they're both good people, Pharaoh's daughter and the nursing mother. But Moshe is a Jew. It says, Vayar b'sivlotam, he saw the suffering. he saw the Egyptian man hitting or beating Ish Evri Me'echav, one of his brethren. So how do we account for this fact that Moshe is a Jew? So I have two suggestions, and I'm happy to hear more suggestions. I have two suggestions. Here's what I used to say. Used to means a long time ago. But when I first started looking at the Chumash, what I said is, this is a person, actually, who chooses to be a Jew. The point of it, he chooses to be a Jew because he sees the suffering. He chooses to be with the people that are suffering. That's his choice that he makes. He could be an Egyptian, Echav, could be either. But Vayar b'Sivul Tom says the Torah, he walked out in the street and he sees people getting beaten up. And he says to himself, I'd rather be with those people than with the guy doing the beating. The guy doing the beating is a mitzvah. The guy receiving the beating is Ish Evri. And that determines what Moshe's identity will be. It's actually, typically we talk about, maybe there's an American myth about sort of creating your own identity, but the reality is that our identity is largely shaped by when we're born, to whom we're born, where we live. These are the factors that shape our identity. In the case of Moshe, though, the Torah sets out this situation. He can actually make a choice because he really is both. He really is an Egyptian. He really is a Jew. And it's a choice. And he has chosen to be a Jew precisely because Vayar b'Sivul Tam. Something about Moshe, he has a real sense of fairness, of equity. And we'll see this in 3 consecutive stories. That's Moshe. It doesn't matter who's involved. It could be 2 Jews, 2 non-Jews, Jew and non-Jew. Doesn't matter. He always sides with the one who's weaker, whether it's the daughters of the priest, whether it's the 2 Jews that are fighting. That's Moshe. That's what I used to say. I still like it. I mean, it's certainly a viable possibility. But I do believe there's something else over here, which is very important for the story. And that, as I mentioned, there are 2 mothers here. There's Pharaoh's daughter, who's mother number 1, and there's the nursing mother, the birth mother, who also nurses him. That's the second mother. So it could be one or the other. But what you have over here, actually, and this is the importance of it, there is actually a third person who is very important. And the third person is Moshe's sister. The sister is watching over him. So it's not one against one. It's not Pharaoh's daughter or the mother, or the natural mother. There's three women over here. There's the mother, and there's the mother, and there's the sister. And the sister is watching out to see what's going to happen, to watch for him. She stands from a distance. And that is the Katuv HaShlishiyah Machriya Beineim. Because what Moshe decides to be with the Jews, to see the Jews as his siblings, is because Moshe was brought up by a sibling. It's because the very sibling is the one watching out for him. And here, having said that, I want to just make one last point about the book of Shemot. At the book of Shemot, we know in the book of Breshit, we know the last chunk of Sefer Breshit, and not just the last chunk. The book, pretty much throughout, when you talk about the transmitting of the covenantal blessing, we're talking about conflict between brothers. The Torah starts with Cain and Hevel, one brother killing the other. But when it comes to the covenantal blessing from Abraham being passed down, there are 2 candidates. There's Yishmael, there's Yitzchak. There's not great antagonism between them, but there's some rivalry there. Then you have Esav and Yaakov. There's a lot of rivalry there. And then, of course, the culminating is Joseph and his brothers. They try to kill him, throw him into a pit where there's no water. He's going to die. So the book of Breshit is, to some extent, to a good extent, I think, about conflict between brothers. When you get to the book of Exodus, though, it's interesting that doesn't seem to be the main problem, because the siblings seem to work pretty well together. Haraya, Moshe and Aaron. Moshe and Aaron, they have disagreements later with golden calf, but it's not actually, there's never a sense of animosity between Moshe and Aaron. I mean, Moshe is angry at Aaron for making the golden calf. Moshe prays for Miriam later. There's always some rivalry, but fundamentally, the brothers seem to get along. And this takes me back to this verse over here about the sister. The sister is watching out for her brother. And perhaps what Moshe's decision to choose the Jewish people as Moshe's brethren, as opposed to the Mitzrayim, can be, I would suggest, is a function of the fact that it's not just one against one, but there's a third party over here, namely his sister, who acts like his mother. It's like a hugger figure, but a caring hugger figure. And she's the one that manages to get Moshe back to his natural Jewish mother. And she's a primary cause of the fact that Moshe has chosen to be a Jew. So those are the two different options. One is he simply chooses based on the morality of it. He sees them being beaten up. And the other is, that's true, but he also is responding to the fact that his own sibling cared for him when he was, in grave danger. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Let me stop and take any comments or questions that anybody may have. Yes.
She nursed him maybe 2 years, maybe 4 years.
Yeah.
And now he's going out to his brother Vayigdal. He's many years passed by. Are we to assume that Yocheved and Miriam still were able to come and visit him, have anything to do with him? Because how could they really have such an influence on him if they hadn't seen him in 10, 15 years?
It's an excellent question. I really have no good answer to that. I will say that in the parallel story, by the way, which is the story of Hannah, who insists upon fully nursing Shmuel before he's sent away to Eli, that in that story, we do have a response to your comment, which is that the book of Shmuel says that whenever Elkanah would go up to Shiloh for his sacrifices, Umeil Katan Taselo Imo, his mother made for Shmuel a little coat, which he would bring up with him over the years when Elkanah would go up to bring the sacrifices. He'd bring the sacrifices, and she would be giving this coat. Coat, of course, in the book of Shmuel is a symbol of kingship, of leadership, etc. The coat of Shmuel is torn or whatever. So there you have a kind of ongoing connection between Hannah and Shmuel. Here, the Torah doesn't say anything, so we don't know. I mean, the Torah doesn't say, but I think symbolically, I think we're to assume that the nursing is in fact not just biological; it's somehow caring for the child, giving the child, of herself, and is seen as a major a factor, at least a factor, in that the fact that Moshe ends up the way he does. But it's a good point. I wonder if there may be, I bet you there's some midrashim that that's the kind of thing the Medrash probably, I'm not familiar, but it wouldn't surprise me to find midrashim which talk about the gap of the years between the nursing, let's say 4, whatever it is, and when he grows up and goes out to his brethren. How old is he? Maybe he's 13. I don't know how old he is. But what happened in the intervening years, the Torah never says. I bet you could find some midrashim now that try to fill in those gaps and make some kind of comments about it. Is there anybody else for a comment? Otherwise, I guess we'll stop at this point. 1:15. 1:15. Oh, it's 11:15, right?
Rabbi, I can't speak.
Yes.
I put my question in the chat.
Okay, I can speak for you. So Deborah's asking, can Miriam's watching over Moshe? Oh, now I'm getting a catch in my throat. Be a tikkun from Cain's, am I my brother's keeper?
No, I would say yes. I mean, right. In other words, I think that's part of the story. Part of the story is, Joseph and the brothers. At the end of the day, Joseph at the end does care for his brothers. Yeah, that's how the book ends. I'm going to take care of you, take care of the family. That Joseph is his brother's keeper at the end. It's a complicated story, but I think that's certainly the case. If you want to build, the point I think is clear. If you want to build a nation, and you can only build a nation if people have some sense of responsibility towards the other. Otherwise, you won't have a nation. You have a collection of individuals. I think the idea that what this book is about, among other things, is somehow, it is about building the nation. How do you take a bunch of slaves and change them into a people that can care for each other and can, empathize, sympathize, and assist the other? That is one of the challenges. Certainly, a lot of the rules in the book that come in are all about that. Even in Sefer Shemot, it's about assisting the other person, etc. Someone who's lost an object, someone who's lost, or whatever it is. So I think that's a very important point, and it's not a simple thing to do, to inculcate in people a sense of responsibility. Okay, so we'll stop at this point and continue next week. And again, glad to reconvene. And we'll hopefully go through the book of Shemot as best we can. There's a lot of interesting stuff that lies in this book, and hopefully we'll be able to tackle some of these core questions. The building.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you,
Thank you.
Rabbi Silber, for a great start to the study of the Sefer. Thank you, everyone, for being here as part of our learning community. We have new Spring Zman classes this week, including community, pluralism, and difference in halachic practice. On Monday night with Rabbi Alex Ozar, and Halacha for the Ages, questioning inflection intended. Reading responsa from a bygone era on Tuesday afternoon at 1 p.m. with Dr. Rachel First. And I have the link in the chat for you to sign up for any of the Spring Zman classes. Thank you, and see you next week.
Thank you.